Hello and welcome to Tisky Sour. We've had some excellent shows recently, but I think we were in danger of getting a little bit cozy in the Novara studio. So I am delighted to say today I am expecting more than a little disagreement. I'm joined by Grace Blakeley, superstar economist of the Corbynite left and author of upcoming Stolen: How Finance Destroyed the Economy and Corrupted Our Politics. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And John McTernan, Director of Political Operations for Tony Blair from 2004 to 2007, and since then in senior advisory roles to Gordon Brown's cabinet and to Julia Gillard when she was Australian PM. You've also become one of the most uncompromising defenders of New Labour's record and the politics they represent.
Yep.
Thank you for joining us in the studio.
Yeah.
Nothing to apologise
for there.
Well, that's precisely what we'll be delving into on this show. This topic is, of course, inspired by the latest incarnation of the project to rescue centrism from irrelevance, which this time round has come in the form of the Progressive Centre think tank, and it's also come with a very good job for comrade Chuka, who's getting £450 an hour to chair this new organisation to try and reinvent centrist politics in Britain. We're going to start with definitions of centrism, but first of all, for inspiration, I'm going to turn to how Chuka developed his riposte to the claim that centrists don't have politics, so we can get up this article as I'm reading the quote. So Chuka says, "Ours is a politics that promotes individual freedom but understands it relies on strong collective provision and an active state to be realised. We believe in reciprocity, which requires an inclusive economy that rewards those who work hard and play by the rules while caring for those who can't support themselves. We are advocates of a rebalancing of power between capital, labour and the consumer, and a rigorous competition to keep the balance of power in check. At the core of our beliefs is the value of work, yet we acknowledge there is more to life than work. Family life in all its forms and the importance of the place where people live are the building blocks of the communitarian ideals to which progressives subscribe. We don't wish to subvert democracy but to enhance it. By ensuring decisions are taken at the lowest possible level, we are unapologetically patriotic and internationalist in orientation too." John, this is all meaningless guff, isn't it?
Well, which bits do you disagree with?
No, that's the point. I'd say my point.
So it's not meaningless if you don't disagree with it. What do you disagree with? Well, it's meaningless
because any politician over the last 40 years could have come out with this speech. It doesn't have any content to me.
That's not entirely true. Margaret Thatcher couldn't have said that.
Which bit of this couldn't Margaret Thatcher have said?
Devolving decisions to the lowest level.
Well, she'd say the lowest level is the individual, the household. We'll devolve decisions to the firm and the individual. It won't be delegated up to trade union leaders.
She democratised trade unions, which is a great reform, and the working class of Britain have actually benefited from that because there was something very, very wrong with the trade unions before Margaret Thatcher democratised them. And they've stayed strong supporters of the Labour Party ever since she brought in the ballots for whether people should affiliate. So, I mean, you can't actually criticise somebody who stopped violent picketing, mass picketing, anybody who stopped car park votes on strikes, who actually brought in ballot. But that's beside the point.
Yeah,
that's
we'll save this up for later. I think the defence of Margaret Thatcher's union reforms is definitely going to be a fiery topic for a little bit later. What I want now is a definition of centrism.
Well, I'm not particularly interested in defining centrism.
So how would you define your politics then?
I've got
politics of New Labour.
New Labour's politics, like
Yeah.
mine, are radical politics.
Okay, tell me what that
So the politics
involves.
of cutting unemployment, cutting poverty, increasing workers' rights at the same time as growing jobs. A politics of refurbishing the public square and actually renewing fully the public fabric, which is why we spent £100 billion on regenerating our towns and cities. Is why we increased spending on the National Health Service to European levels. Is why we increased public spending from 33% of GDP when we came in to 39% of GDP. We did, and we extended massive new rights to workers. We were a great government, a radical government, and we showed that you can actually give rights to women. We actually smashed the neoliberal myth that you have to take away rights from workers in order to increase employment. We gave more rights to workers, and we increased employment at the same time. We smashed almost every single myth, and at the same time we liberated, gay people, lesbians. We took away the homophobic Section 28. We focused money and attention to the early years through Sure Start. We focused more on those with the most need. It's a great record.
All right, Grace, I want your definition of centrism. Centrist politics, centrist economics.
So, for me, centrism is meaningless outside of the historical context in which it was kind of conceptualized. And talking particularly here about the kind of, centre-left, centre-right dichotomy that really emerged during the 1990s. Because essentially, this kind of set of policies and approach to kind of economic management was an attempt to maintain the political economic bargain that had been instituted in the 1980s, which essentially revolved around the liberation of the financial sector, which would allow for the creation of masses of debt, which could be channeled into asset purchases. So I'm thinking here, property owning democracy, pension fund capitalism, combined with privatization, that would be another giveaway for the middle classes, and the kind of financialization of the firm. So the rise of this ideology of shareholder value, the freeing up of kind of institutional investors to kind of discipline firms and make sure that they were acting in the interests of kind of financial capital. Basically kind of, leveraging the resources that this model created, particularly because of the growing prominence of the finance sector, the capital inflows that resulted from the kind of debt-fueled growth model that we pursued, and obviously the increase in asset prices that were also created by that. And by kind of, skimming a bit off the top of that model, the New Labour was able to kind of undertake some redistribution to expand the size of the state, obviously with the proviso that they were maintaining the kind of fundamental tenets of neoliberal political economy, which rely on this neoliberal welfarist discourse based on the distinction between the deserving and the undeserving poor, and also bringing the private sector into the provision of of public services and of public infrastructure spending, because failing to do that would undermine the central basis of neoliberal political economy, which was the kind of disempowerment of labour and the breaking of that bargain between labour and the state. That model allowed New Labour to kind of implement certain reforms, allowed them to basically ride the wave of the expanding economy that resulted from essentially financialization and asset price inflation, but which ultimately culminated in the crash of 2007. Everything that has happened macroeconomically since 1980 really has kind of, facilitated the emergence of this model, which was called the Great Moderation, but which you now know was kind of laying the basis for what happened in 2007. And so ultimately, contextualizing centrism in that way means that it is dead, because it died in 2007 when all that money dried up, when we got to the point of the maximum level of debt that could be created, when capital stopped flowing into the UK. The flows of capital into the UK decreased. For me, it's a particular historical period marked by essentially a massive increase in free money that allowed for the kind of elision of real political opposition.
So, that's the classic, critique of New Labour from the left, which is the idea that...
Is it classic? I like to think it's quite original.
It's groundbreaking.
Thank you.
It's remarkably ahistorical and afactual.
Okay, well, let me formulate it as a question, John. So I'd say, even if yours is groundbreaking, but the traditional left-wing analysis of New Labour is that...
Oh, so it's 2 against 1, I get it.
I'm
my friend?
Well, you're on our show, John. You're on our show. Invite me onto yours and you can pack it with whoever you want. Anyway,
not my way.
I'm phrasing a question, and I don't hide my politics. So, the critique of New Labour would be that Margaret Thatcher put in place a particular political economy in Britain in the 1980s. It was one that empowered private capital at the expense of collective institutions in terms of who has power in our society. What New Labour did was they accepted this political economic framework, but they didn't actually raise taxes. But what they did manage to do was redistribute slightly more, considerably more. They managed to redistribute in the sense of cash transfers to people at the bottom end of the income ladder, especially if they were elderly or single-parent families or families with young children.
Or they were pensioners, or they were working
But
families.
the critique is that you didn't challenge the fundamental political economy of the society, which was introduced by Margaret Thatcher, which empowered private capital and disempowered collective institutions. Do you think that's fair?
No, of course I don't think that's fair. Let's go back to what Grace said. Utterly ahistorical account of the post-war development of the British financial sector, which has been one of the there's been 2 huge triumphs of British economic planning since the Second World War. One of them is the growth of the financial sector, which goes back to the Wilson government, goes back before the Wilson government. It's been a sustained desire to build a world-class industry, and it's done that. The second is, which is mainly Labour, which has been the sustained expansion of higher education. Both of them are substantial industrial strategies, and both of them have actually delivered incredibly well. It is nonsense on stilts to say that Labour in any way accepted a Thatcherite settlement of the relationship between the state, the government, and the individual, the government and communities. Labour created new institutions. Sure Start is a good example of new institutions.
Is there collective power in Sure Start?
It was the movement to create childcare is a demand from working parents, mainly led on a voluntary basis, charitable basis by women. They built a network across the country, and then under the leadership of people like Harriet Harman, that was not just recognised as a political demand. It was funded massively, expanded, and it was actually it's one of that with tax credits, probably two of the things that people, working class voters, said that they got the best out of from the Labour government. It's why they voted for us in 2005, why they voted when they did in 2010, why that election was so close even after the economic crash. But the notion, which is what haunts all this discussion, the notion that there's no difference between the Margaret Thatcher government of 1979 and the Labour government in 1997 is ridiculous. And there's really no point in pretending that you can have a discussion about that, because it is a ridiculous notion.
Can I come back on that?
Yes, you can.
So I never said there was no difference whatsoever. For me, the difference between Thatcherism and New Labour is essentially by the end of Thatcher's government, she had implemented a set of policies that were really quite deeply unsustainable. If not, obviously they're economically unsustainable, but politically unsustainable. People really started to notice the kind of rising levels of inequality and the kind of economic fragility that was kind of taking place in the early 1990s. And what Labour did was kind of sustain Thatcher's basic bargain. And remember, Thatcher's basic bargain was one between the top 1% and the middle classes, based on the kind of proliferation of asset ownership through property-owning democracy, so giving people access to owning their own homes, and privatising their pensions in the context of asset price inflation. So a huge amount of debt was created to allow people to buy their homes. That debt drove up the price of housing, which then, led to a massive windfall gain for the middle classes, which ensured that they would kind of maintain their support for a system which ultimately primarily benefited the 1%. That was combined with generalised asset price inflation in financial markets that ensured the value of people's pensions continued to rise. And this is basically what sustained the political economy, the bargain of Thatcherism, as well as sustaining the bargain that underlay New Labour. The difference being that New Labour did, as I said, kind of take some money off the top out of that model and plough it back into making society less unequal, and to an extent, therefore, making it slightly more sustainable. I also just want to come back to that point on the growth of the finance, kind of naturalising the growth of the finance sector in the aftermath of the Second World War, because really what kind of consolidated the city's international reputation as really the centre of international finance was the rise of the Eurodollar markets in the 1950s and 60s, which was essentially city banks skirted around regulation, skirted around kind of capital controls and the jurisdiction of the Fed to create these offshore markets in dollars that allowed kind of, speculation and trading in the UK in dollars and other currencies to boom, because that wasn't allowed in the US because of things like Regulation Q. And that was, partly to do with the lobbying of the city and this, continuous city, Bank of England and Treasury nexus, whereby, the people in these institutions know one another very well and they kind of cooperate on how this set of institutions is going to be regulated and lobbied. We saw that the city spent £95 million on lobbying the year after Brexit. Yeah, I mean,
spent it before the year before Brexit.
Well, I mean, I'm sure they spent a lot of that. That was just an FOI request. But, that kind of idea that it was a natural development that the city grew and became this hub of international finance.
No, it's an industrial strategy. I said it was a chosen industrial strategy.
Well, exactly. One based on essentially lobbying.
It was uncontroversial.
One based on lobbying and
No. I'm the ahistorical nature of the account that.
Can you just, because you keep calling it ahistorical, I'd like to understand why you think this account is ahistorical.
Well, for the reasons I said, in which you appear to be agreeing with, that so Britain has had a different structure of industrial ownership. It didn't start in the 1980s.
No, I'm not saying it
did. So it's not a 1980s formation that was then taken on by the Labour Party. The country had the biggest change that Margaret Thatcher did, the biggest liberation she did for working people, was to sell them council houses, which was actually, it's not a cascade of assets to the middle class, it's a cascade of assets to working class people, and it changed the nature of Scotland, changed the nature of London, changed the nature of our country, changed it for the better in my view. But that's the notion that everything you're describing is either, there's no difference between Thatcher and Blair, and it all happened in the 1980s.
And that's not what I said.
You said all a continuation.
I said a continuation of the political economic structure and power relations in society.
So I'm at this I'm disagreeing with then. But the notion that these things don't, that the things that happened in the 80s and the 90s don't have deep roots in Britain and in the structure of the British economy, I just disagree with you.
I know, actually, I would completely agree. I mean, arguably, what you saw in the 1980s was, because really what was put in place in the aftermath of the post-war period was a kind of aberration in terms of the fundamental relationship between, in the power relations that govern kind of, British political economy. In the aftermath of the war, you saw a lot of wealth being wiped out. You saw the kind of emergence of real organised working class power, which fed into the creation of this post-war consensus, helped massively by, the international context, which involved the kind of curbing of capital mobility that really kind of put kind of capital to a greater extent back in its box. This underlay the kind of, most... a period of really strong, equal and fair growth in British history. But it was, underlain by, as I've said, the kind of attempt by financial actors to kind of undermine that, by, the emergence of groups that were directly seeking to remove the kind of Keynesian bargain between workers and the state and undermine the unions and those sorts of things, those kind of groups centred around like Mont Pelerin in particular. And so what you saw in the 1980s was in many ways a reversion to the ordinary relationship between British financial capital and the state, typified by the kind of Citibank Treasury nexus. What I think that the difference was that in the context of kind of majoritarian, democracy, Thatcher had to provide enough benefits to a large enough electoral constituency to make the model that ultimately benefited the 1% benefit enough people that would vote for them. And this is why I'd just like to come in on this point about, I'll finish here. The biggest liberation that Thatcher delivered was giving... No, we're talking about the political economy that I'm arguing. Basically, I'm arguing that there was a new mode of accumulation that emerged in British society towards the end of the 1970s and the early 1980s. And that was sustained until 2007. And it was underpinned by this point. So you said the biggest liberation that Thatcher delivered was giving people ownership of their council houses. And you said that those were mainly working class people, which is true. At that time, they were working class people and their interests were therefore aligned with the union movement, with other working class people. The genius of Thatcherism was to give these people enough debt to be able to buy their homes in the context of continuous house price inflation, so that they would come to identify their interests with capital. And that is essentially the bargain that underlay Thatcherism, it underlay Blairism, and ultimately it obviously collapsed in 2007.
You do know there wasn't continuous house price inflation during the period you're talking about.
I mean, yeah, there was like a blip in 1989, but overall...
There was a housing price crash, it wasn't a blip.
It was. When you look at the actual model, when you look at the graph, it was...
Let's stick to New Labour.
No.
So under New Labour, house prices rose considerably.
You probably need somebody from the Thatcher government here to defend the Thatcher
We'll
government.
talk about,
fine, we'll go on to the 1990s.
So under the New Labour government, house prices rise in a sustained way. That's partly because of the liberation of finance. It's quite easy to give out a mortgage. And that's also because social councils aren't building anything. Councils aren't building any homes under the New Labour period. Or historically, it's social housing
is being built by housing associations. New housing is being created on brownfield developments. And 2 million existing council homes are being brought up to decent homes level because, again, missing from this account that you both seem to love, is the notion that the Labour government did nothing with the public sphere. The Labour government reversed the notion that public services were inevitably declining, that the NHS had to be reduced to the point where only people with no cash could use it, and then it would, and that the logical thing for other people to do was to go private. The Labour Party renovated core public institutions.
You improved public services. I mean, we'd all admit that you improved public services. Hospitals were much better in 2007 than they were in 1997. So are schools, undoubtedly. I suppose the issue is...
Schools are undoubtedly better.
Yeah, absolutely. The issue is that because there was no challenge of the city, no challenge of finance capital, the areas where you can't just pump money into something to solve a problem, like housing, for example. I mean, would you admit that we have a housing crisis in this country?
We have a set of different housing challenges, and they're different depending on where you want to go. But I mean, we have a housing skills, we have a construction skills shortage. We definitely have a financial challenge. We have a developable land problem. We have there's different challenges in Oldham than there are in Peckham.
I know you
There's
have
at least
four
four or five different housing
I
challenges.
think you're kind of making a straw man out of my argument, because I never at any point said that there was no difference between what happened under Blair and what happened under Thatcher. I completely agree.
You're making a straw man of my argument to then say I've got a straw man. It's actually Michael that's a problem here.
Sorry, Michael. So I definitely don't think there was no difference. As I said, I think that, the macroeconomic structures that were put in place in the 1980s as a kind of continuation of the, of British political economy
I'm struggling to understand what you think should have been done. I suppose it would be much clearer if you said what you think the problem actually, what is the sort of radical action outside of capital controls being reintroduced that you think should have been done?
So the big fix that this kind of extension of home ownership and of pension funds was attempting to fix was the kind of secular decline in wages that we saw from around 1979, and that was largely due to the to Thatcher's kind of decimation of the union movement. And we spoke earlier about the kind of, you were saying that Thatcher democratised the union movement. I mean, that's clearly not what she intended to do. One of her closest advisors said explicitly that it was something like, in Marxist terms, what we were trying to do was increase the reserve army of labour. And of course, this is intimately linked to a Thatcherite model for the economy, premised upon the idea that it is businesses' sole responsibility to make profits and look after their shareholders.
Once again, you probably
and therefore undertaking a redistribution within firms away from workers and towards shareholders. And that was a model that continued very much under New Labour. In fact, the increase in wages under New Labour it was about 1.5% in the 10 years between 1990 and 2007, compared to about 2.3% between 1970 and 1980. And we've seen this kind of general decline in wage growth up until the financial crisis, when wages actually stagnated in real terms. And when you combine that with rising house prices, and also the kind of general, you say that New Labour was all about increasing access to public services, but actually what you did was kind of make sure that state spending was also providing another avenue for profit generation for the private sector by introducing massively more expensive innovations like private financing and outsourcing of many different services, which were really, an attempt to kind of, give a bit of a kind of...
Okay, you should probably unpack some of your arguments. You're deliberately forcing all these things together.
Okay. But what would you like to unpack?
Well, the first thing is that outsourcing saved money, one thing. Two things, profit is a good thing. Three things, PFI was actually the only game in town in terms of actually having access to enough capital to avoid capital queuing. There wasn't an option.
So,
there was an option. There was an option to do what happened in my own city of Edinburgh, which was the 1963 District General Hospital planned a hospital in Edinburgh, which was, the land was purchased in the early 1970s, and it was cancelled in 1976. It wasn't built, the new Edinburgh Royal Infirmary wasn't built until 1999 because the Scottish Government accessed PFI money. We could perfectly well have been waiting in a long queue for capital prioritisation, but we got rid of the outside toilets in primary schools, and we got new buildings built. That was
and
a choice
now we have a report from the National Audit Office showing that private financing initiatives are often 40% more expensive than had you borrowed up front. And particularly in
that
the
borrowing
context
wasn't available. You can't borrow willy-nilly. The borrowing capacity wasn't available.
Governments are perfectly capable of issuing bonds for investment, as you well know, because generally the fiscal multiplier, that's the amount the government gains back in tax revenues for every pound it spends, is at least one.
You sound like a spending minister. I mean, all spending ministers have plans of every spending minister, in my experience, knows how to spend to save. Well, they know how to spend. They have no idea how to save.
I'm not entirely sure what your point is here, because are you saying that infrastructure investment doesn't improve, doesn't create a multiplier effect?
The Humber Bridge.
Are you like an anti-Keynesian?
No, I'm not an anti-Keynesian, but you're. But
So the disagreement here is about cost, right? Because you're saying what the New Labour should have done is they should have borrowed to build these things themselves.
It's sequencing.
Exactly.
So
Which would have been
just
cheaper.
let me just clear up what the disagreement is, right? So what Grace is saying is when New Labour invested in infrastructure around the country, what they should have done, hospitals, schools, what they should have done is borrow that money themselves and build it. Obviously, they'd be contracting out to some building companies. It wouldn't all be built by state employees, but they'd borrow the money to build it and they'd own it. What New Labour did is they contracted out not just the building of it, but the financing of it, right? So you've got a private company to build the hospital and then to rent it back to the government.
Because
And
there are limits on what a government can borrow.
well, except the argument is
There's no limits. No, I know Grace argues there's no limits.
Of course I'm not arguing that
the
there's no
argument
limits.
isn't there's no limits. The argument is one that's more cost effective. So that's the key thing, right? So PFI.
That's not the key thing.
What is the key thing?
It's
right?
a thing. It's not
So
the key thing.
If you're saying it was difficult for New Labour at the time to borrow money so that they could build a hospital by building it at PFI, which, as Grace has said, I mean, you might not accept this, but it's 40% more expensive than if they built it themselves. What that does is that commits future governments to paying private companies to rent the hospitals off them.
All capital spending commits future governments to some form of maintenance. It's like the council blocks.
Yeah, but there's different amounts.
Council
aren't
blocks on the Old Kent Road are capital spending in the past that commit the current council of Southwark and the government in their support.
But the maintenance when you're renting it off a private company, the maintenance is a lot more expensive because it's not just maintenance; it's also rent.
It also
And you're
massively higher interest payments. I mean, it's just, financial markets aren't stupid. They know that a government whose bonds are always going to be cheap, well, except in very extreme cases when governments don't have control over their own monetary policy, is going to be cheaper. They are much more likely to buy government bonds, i.e. lend to a government, to allow that government to engage in infrastructure spending that will ultimately expand the economy, rather than doing what New Labour tried to do, which was they had to force investors, they had to corral them into these weird special purpose vehicles, which, we're now dealing with the legacy of, because in order to get the private sector to lend this kind of money, you basically had to write all the risk out of the contracts. So now, even if, they default, the government's still basically on the hook for all the spending. Rather than, basically doing what was very obvious in economic terms, they corralled the public sector into making it much more expensive. It was just utterly bizarre.
Your basic critique of New Labour is that
we're talking about a specific thing. We're talking about PFI.
No. Your basic critique of New Labour is that we didn't borrow enough money. That's basically what you're saying.
No, we're talking about one thing: private financing initiatives. And I was talking about how this represents the attempt to bring private money into the provision of state services in order to basically enrich private shareholders from kind of government spending.
That's so. So there's more than obviously this is all.
You've got 2 more minutes on PFI, then we're going to move to the present.
Yeah, no. So that, I mean, the notion that shareholders aren't real people, the shareholders aren't pensions, pensioners. The shareholders,
I had this debate with someone from the Taxpayers Alliance the other day.
For sure. I mean, I've got most local authority workers have pension, got their pension invested in pension funds. And
because of Thatcher.
It's not because of Thatcher.
Because of the privatisation of pension funds, which led to asset price inflation, which caused the financial crisis.
Yeah, right.
Okay, we've got a good segue into the financial crisis there. Yeah. I'm moving it up to the present. I'm going to give you 2 quotes. One from Navarro Media's inspiration. Keeps us going. Chuka Ramuna. This is, I think, the 8th paragraph in his most recent article. So he says, there is a new generation of politicians, mostly in their late 30s and 40s, leading the progressive charge internationally. Chuka Ramuna, incidentally, is 40, so I'm not... It's quite clear who he's talking about there. These politicians respect the achievements of the wave of third way leaders of the 90s and noughties, but also recognise that times have changed, which means different modern solutions to today's big problems. They often get lumped in with the leaders of the past, but the big difference between this generation and the earlier generation of progressives is that their politics has been formed in a post-crash world. My next quote is from Simon Wren Lewis, the Oxford economist. He says, Labour's responsibility for the 2008 crash, not because they spent too much, but because the Labour government, like their Conservative predecessors, brought about or tolerated a regulation regime and a financial sector that allowed the global financial crisis to have a particularly damaging effect on the UK economy. I want a simple question. So, John, what have you learned from the financial crisis? Has your politics changed since 2008?
I've learned you probably shouldn't let Tory governments try to take us out of recession. because they'll strangle growth and they'll make the wrong decisions. And they've given us, this current government has given us one lost decade, and they're intent to give us a second lost decade. So, but like.
So just for clarification, I'm not going to do the riposte. So for clarification, you looking at what happened in 2008, you don't think New Labour should have had in any way a different relationship to the City of London?
Not particularly, no.
What do you think?
I disagree.
Really? Colour me surprised.
What the economics profession as a whole has learnt from so obviously, you know, and in many ways I kind of don't really blame the policymakers that were kind of doing this under New Labour, because all the economics wisdom of the time suggested that, you know, we were in this era of the Great Moderation, where we'd effectively solved the problem of the business cycle, where the kind of giving independence to the Bank of England and allowing them to change interest rates to kind of mute the upswings and downswings of the business cycle would, you know, effectively like immunize our economy against any big recessions. And that was allegedly proved by the dot-com bubble, which, you know, didn't have a massive impact on the real economy. But what economists learnt after 2007 was essentially that Minsky was right, and that the post-Keynesians, and actually to an extent even the Austrian school of like the 1920s and 30s, had pinpointed a relationship between debt, between asset prices and goings on in the real economy that, you know, looking back, people should have been more aware of when you know, making changes to not just like financial regulation, but also what's called macroprudential policy generally. So things like, you know, how much debt we allow to accumulate in the economy. And we saw a massive, unprecedented increase in levels of household debt, which of course Colin Crouch talks about as privatized Keynesianism, as essentially, you know, the government steps away from attempting to kind of moderate the business cycle through its own debt, and therefore households are forced to kind of take on that burden themselves. And a lot of it, of course, goes into housing, which again leads, you know, creates a capital gain, which you know, enriches many people over that period and kind of ensures their continued loyalty to this particular model. But, you know, ultimately it does crash in 2007, and that has just as much to do with the kind of failure of governments in particularly the US and the UK in moderating the amount of debt that was created for vast swathes of the population.
I don't think a global financial system, which includes Europe as well as America and the United Kingdom, can be regulated by the actions of one government. One of the giant tensions in modern politics is the right's anger at multilateral institutions, which is what's driving them to try towards Brexit. It's driving the populist right in Europe to try to exit the euro. It's the fuel of the right's hatred of the IPCC and the COP process, which is that the right has a hatred of multilateral institutions. Actually, progressives by and large should support multilateral institutions. The consequence of multilateral action is that it's slow, just as, you know, the currently seized up Doha round. So it's really, I genuinely find it hard to pinpoint that moment and that action or that set of actions that the New Labour government should have taken. This was, you know, we'd be talking very differently if James Comey hadn't spoken about the emails. We'd be talking very differently if Lehman Brothers hadn't been, allowed to crash to teach the other people a lesson. We could be in a very different situation. So I am genuinely unclear about. I do not doubt for 1 second the instability of global markets. I don't doubt for 1 second your desire to return to Bretton Woods and capital controls and all these things, but it's not clear to me how a Labour government within a mesh of multilateral institutions could have achieved that. So I'm like,
there's a good challenge in there, and then we're going to move on to like what a left government should do now. What should New Labour have done differently?
So
and when?
The reason that kind of long boom that led up to 2007 went on for so long is that the kind of general ceilings that would have existed in the domestic economy and the amount of debt that could be created were eroded for two reasons. Firstly, and most importantly, really, you had the emergence of these global imbalances. So China, Germany, various other countries with massive current account surpluses, the UK and the US, the deficit countries with massive current account deficits. Capital was flowing out of the US and the UK, couldn't really find anywhere else in the global economy to go to find such high returns. And financial deregulation in both of those countries meant that there was already a round of asset price inflation going on. So all that capital that flowed out of those countries from the current account came back in via the financial account and flowed into UK banks, which allowed them to effectively lend more than they otherwise might have. They also flowed into the second point, which is financial securities, but debt-based financial securities, so the collateralized debt obligations, the asset-backed securities, etc., etc. And this was another mechanism that allowed banks to go on lending longer than they might have, because they took a mortgage, they spliced it up with a load of other ones, and then they sold that on, which gave them the money from that mortgage now and allowed them to make more mortgages. And it also, you know, the way that the system was structured in terms of shadow banking, parking assets off balance sheet, all these sorts of parking liabilities off balance sheet, all these sorts of things, allowed that kind of thing to go on much longer than it might have. So really, what, you know, states who...
We should have had a crash earlier. That would have been helpful.
No.
us.
What we should have done was a couple of different things. Limit, well, I mean, yes, if the crash had come earlier, it would have been smaller and probably decimated economies much less. So what we should have done is firstly prevented banks from doing these securities.
A bit more mortgage rationing.
Yeah, definitely. So controls on capital inflows would have been number one.
Capital controls.
Preventing.
So it's a better,
Can I possibly just finish my point, John? So firstly, controls on capital inflows. Secondly, preventing banks from creating these kind of financial securities. And finally, just better policy in terms of limiting bank lending. That was all I was going to say.
Yeah, no. So basically, it's a better 1970s.
It's a better 1970s.
Credit controls, which we all had in the 1970s. Mortgage rationing, which we had in the 1970s. Lots of cancellising like we had in the 1970s. Just a better 1970s.
I mean, so we didn't have credit rationing in the 1970s, really. We had the building societies, which weren't allowed to create money, which is what limited mortgage lending. But, I mean, these controls wouldn't have catalysed a kind of return to the 1970s. They just would have prevented another financial crisis, and obviously constrained credit creation in the domestic economy, which obviously would have limited the amount that households had in terms of discretionary income. But that could have been solved again by wider macroeconomic reform to ensure that people's wages were going up, to kind of restore collective bargaining, to, you know, kind of reduce these incentives around shareholder value that existed in the financial system, and actually ensure that firms were paying their workers rather than just distributing all their money to shareholders.
Yeah, no, look, I mean, the one thing which, looking back on it, I think, and I know other New Labour radicals like myself, think we could have done more of is... there was a bargain to be done with the union movement about collective bargaining, and the fact that the unions didn't want to dance doesn't mean that we shouldn't have done that. We should have done more, given more collective bargaining powers back. I'd say that as somebody who's worked in the Australian system, where there's nothing about the EBA system which actually prevents the decline of union membership. Australian unions have got the same lack of density as British unions, but they are they set wages across the whole country, because enterprise bargaining covers between 40 and 50% of workers. At that point, you're setting the wage rates for the whole country. So I think that is an area where we probably could have and should have done more, but the partners weren't there. Apart from the great union of USDOR, the partners weren't there to bargain with, really. So,
if only all trade unions were like USDOR. That's the conclusion.
I know. Well, growing membership in the private sector. If only all unions were like USDOR.
Yeah, I think
no, we're not going to go into that. Right? I think we've had a good debate over New Labour's economic policies. We're going to move on to the alternatives. There is obviously a party which is offering an alternative. It's the current Labour Party, under Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell. They're offering a radically different economic strategy, economic policy. You've been rather critical of it, John. Where do you think the new Labour is going wrong? Or do you think there's anywhere it's going right?
So The biggest criticism I've got of Corbynite McDonaldism is the extent to which it is just a kind of reheated Sturgeonism, which is the attempt to create a gigantic middle-class welfare state. And I've got really nothing but contempt for people who pretend to be radicals, but who actually want to give money to middle-class people. That's what the abolition of tuition fees is all about. That's why there's no money being put to one side for universal credit. That's why there's no push to restore the cuts in universal credit. So my critique of the Corbynite McDonaldism is that it actually is not just it is real centrism. It's not parodic centrism. It's not what you think my politics, which are radical and not centrist. It actually really is. Let's give the middle classes free stuff and hope they vote for us, which is exactly the Nicola Sturgeon strategy. And so there's a really strange form of concealed centrism hiding in plain sight in British politics at the moment.
Grace, is all McDonald and what did you call it? Corbynite McDonaldism?
Yes.
Does all it have to offer bribes for the rich, bribes for the middle class?
Class is not the rich.
I think what's interesting is that, like, someone who's been in politics and observed economic policy for the last 40 years might look at the Corbyn-McDonald agenda as kind of, as you said, what was it? A kind of gigantic middle-class welfare state, trying to create that. But I think that's largely because the ideology around neoliberalism and neoclassical economics made sure that we, as the left, kind of gave over the debate about what we were doing with the commanding heights of the economy. So we essentially said macroeconomic policy is going to be left to, the Bank of England monetary policy on the one hand, financial stability to a kind of set of regulatory agencies, and fiscal policy would be deeply constrained by this idea that, there was very strict limits on the amount that you were able to borrow. And those questions were all kind of just dismissed and said, we've fixed those. Neoclassical economics has conclusively come up with the solutions. And of course, what we learned in 2007 was that was all essentially wrong. And the kind of academic neoclassical economics had provided a kind of cover for creeping neoliberalism. What we've got now is a return to the idea that the state and the left can actually deal with the really central issues that don't just determine kind of what happens to the gains that are created by the economy, but actually structure the way economic activity takes place. And so things like tuition fees, things like, nationalizations, those sorts of things, John McDonnell's ownership funds, those sorts of things, they are essentially trying to change the nature of economic accumulation, which will have wide-ranging structural effects throughout, that will cascade throughout the whole of the economy onto wages, onto, various other things. And that doesn't mitigate the need for what you're talking about, things like, massively reforming universal credit, which, I agree, there's a big hole there in terms of welfare policy. But I think to dismiss that as kind of middle-class welfare statism is to kind of misunderstand the driving ideological force behind those.
I don't misunderstand the driving ideological force of a desire, an extraordinary desire, in my view, to renationalize an 18th century technology. I mean, we're in the 21st century, and the 18th century technology of the fixed way. We're going to, the radical heart of the Labour government's policies is on the 200th anniversary of passenger rail services to get them into public ownership.
That's a bank. National Rail is already nationalised.
And it should be privatised, obviously. But that could be some money we can spend on something sensible. But the stated aim of expropriation without full compensation for, say, the shares of the water companies is pretty unpopular. More unpopular than that.
Wait, you think nationalising the water companies is unpopular?
Nationalising the water companies, expropriating them.
Factually incorrect.
No.
It's very popular amongst most voters.
No, expropriating the shares and not paying the full market price for them is actually unfair and will be unpopular.
It's not unpopular, though.
No, nobody's actually asked people, do you want them nationalised without compensation?
I don't
So
think
how do
they
you know it's
particularly
unpopular?
care.
I don't know. I know that when you ask the public what should be in public ownership, water is one of the things that the majority say should be.
Yeah.
I haven't seen any data on whether or not we should give full compensation
I say to you,
the shareholders.
do you want a chunk of your future pension portfolio taken away from you at no value or reduced value? People are going to go, what do you mean? But the really unpopular policy, the most ridiculous one, which is the tax on British jobs and British companies, which I think you called the ownership fund. The notion that companies which are owned and run in Britain should have a forcibly higher tax rate on them than companies which are owned in America, or owned in France, owned in continental Europe, owned in Africa. But people work here. That's ridiculous.
But there are already massive differences in tax regimes all around the world. And I mean, obviously, this isn't a tax, but even if it was...
A British company, a British-owned company, will be forced to pay a higher rate of tax to the government because they'll be forced to put its own...
But companies pay tax where they're
No, wait a minute.
Actually, they don't, but they're supposed to.
British-owned companies will be forced by John McDonnell's economic policy to create this ownership fund, which is a way of actually increasing corporation tax through the back door. American-owned companies, which actually employ people in Britain, they won't. French-owned companies that employ people in Britain, they won't. It's only British-owned companies that will be forced to create these ownership funds. So it's a backdoor tax on jobs in British companies. I definitely think that's unpopular.
So firstly, it's not a tax. It's
well, it is because the returns above above £500 dividend will be returned to the exchequer. They'll be taken by the
But it's from dividends, not profits. Isn't that the difference? Because if you tax profits, that's going to affect investment. But if it's a dividend, then it's already by definition has not been reinvested in the company. Because dividends is what you give back to shareholders. It's by definition not going to be reinvested.
And it's also the point about it is that you're giving an equity stake to workers. Right, and up to 10%, so it's not massively radical, because some people argue it could be more radical. But the point of this fund is both to ensure...
Only British company, domicile companies.
Okay, well, we'll come to that in a second, but let's just clarify the point about the fund. So the fund will make sure that... so companies are obviously, their ownership is mediated by financial markets. They are owned by shareholders generally when they're publicly floated companies. Mm-hmm. Those shareholders tend to be the wealthiest people in society. Ownership of... Yeah, they are the Gini coefficient, so the measure of equality for... equity ownership is incredibly high. Basically, the wealthiest people are the most likely to own equities, which is unsurprising given that many corporate executives are remunerated using various forms of the attempt to kind of link up the way in which corporate executives are paid with the creation of shareholder value means that a lot of them get paid kind of in shares or similar sorts of things. Shareholders are generally very, very wealthy. This is an attempt to rebalance not only, again, ownership of private pension fund wealth is also heavily skewed towards the top end of the income distribution. This is an attempt to ensure that, ordinary people who work in firms not only gain a kind of amount of the profit in terms of the profit that they've created, they also gain a stake in kind of determining how these firms are run. So making sure that they're, better for the environment, making sure they're treating their workforce well, making sure that they're kind of generally behaving ethically. Workers are going to have a say in, influencing the future direction of these companies. Secondly, this point about it being a tax and, already Walmart... that's a bad example, but an American company that operates in the UK pays American taxes, whereas a UK company operating in the UK pays UK taxes. And the kind of tax competition agenda to which you're alluding to has massively undermined, revenues taken by the global north, countries in the global north all around the world. At least partly because, in the absence of any restrictions on the ability of companies and shareholders to move capital around the world, then you can just shop around until you park all your assets in Bermuda and pay 0% tax. So again, this kind of tax competition agenda speaks to the need for limits on capital mobility.
Look, so a little sidebar, which is, if we were serious about taxation, then the first thing we'd do is declare war on Liechtenstein and all the tax havens within the European Union.
Totally agree. Which is what we're going to do.
Yeah, no. So that is a thing. That's a battle that needs to be done, and battle needs to be taken. And there's slow progress multilaterally on that, but within the European Union, it's been extraordinary. There's been such slow. I mean, and one understands politically why nobody wants to talk about Luxembourg and Liechtenstein, all the other tax havens, or Jersey, or Andorra, or all the. That is entirely separate, in my view, to the notion, the one notion, which is that there should be something done to British companies. So, Nissan won't have to create an ownership fund, whereas a British-owned company will. That is a difference between a British-owned company
build
and
a British-owned Nissan.
I think
so
also.
This is really important, because essentially, the contours of your view of the future are they're credit controls. They are siege economy. Build our own Nissan. That's essentially where you're ending this up. I don't think that workers who work for Honda or Nissan mind working for foreign-owned companies. I think people might mind working for British-owned companies if there's a bigger burden on them through this ownership fund. But the ultimate thing is, what comes through in the end about this is the real truth about Corbynite McDonaldism is that Corbynite McDonaldism is the expression. It's a vanguardist politics. We don't know what the hidden agenda of McDonnell and Corbyn is. We have a reasonably decent view of it sometimes, a flicker of it, an ankle of it, sometimes in looking at foreign policy, where we know that the leader of the Labour Party supports a one-state solution in the Middle East, in Israel-Palestine, and that state isn't Israel, that state is Palestine. But
is that true? I'm pretty sure that's not.
No, he does. He does actually. He does. He's on it.
Support a two-state solution.
Labour's explicit policy is for a two-state solution, but historically it's unclear whether or not he backed a one-state solution or a two-state solution.
The leader of the opposition is a vanguardist politician. John McDonnell is definitely a vanguardist politician, and so the question is, what is the actual? What are we really seeing? 10% of companies is a massive expropriation of those companies, and yes, it is radical. Is it right? Probably not, in my view.
I think.
Firstly, I don't think.
Quickly, then we're going to move to questions.
Okay, I don't think it's. I think it's. Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell's aims are very explicit. In fact, their aims are listed on the back of your Labour Party membership card. It's for democratic socialism, which involves much greater ownership by working people of the commanding heights of the economy. Secondly, this point around it's not as though we need to understand what's going on in Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell's heads to figure out the direction of the Labour Party, because to a greater extent than ever before, and not enough of an extent, but to a greater extent than ever before, the Labour Party is democratised. So the policies that the leadership will implement are going to be, in one way or another, they're going to be accountable to the membership, and that is a journey that we have a lot further to go on. But ultimately, Corbynism is not about Jeremy Corbyn. It's people from all over the country coming together in order to kind of upend this ridiculously unfair economic model that we've been living under for the last 40 years and chart a way forward.
When your leader is a narcissist,
that was the final point. That was the final point.
It is always all about him. Everything is always about.
You work for Tony Blair and you're calling Jeremy Corbyn a narcissist.
He's not a narcissist. No, Jeremy Corbyn is a classic narcissist.
All right, we're going to go to questions. First of all, as ever, we need money. Novara Media always needs money. We want to grow. We want to expand, so we can keep having these expansive debates that you won't see on the BBC. Or you might see them on the BBC when we have a socialist government and we do some radical reforms and that kind of thing. But until then,
and the workers own 10% of the BBC.
Well, we own 100% of the BBC.
The workers who work for the BBC. I thought that was your entire policy.
Well, the BBC is not a profit-making organisation. There's no dividends, so it wouldn't make sense, would it? I mean, I think it'd be great to have 10% of the board with people who work at the BBC on it in terms of governance. But it won't work in terms of dividends. Anyway, Novara Media also doesn't have dividends. We run purely on your donations, on your subscriptions. As you know, we are asking for a very modest 1 hour's wage a month so we can continue working around the clock. When we have
our IPO, it'll be fine.
I was going to say, have you thought about going public?
Have we thought about going public?
How much do you have to have as
I've got no idea how it works.
To list on the London Stock Exchange?
You can give us some advice afterwards, John.
You've got an economist here.
Actually, I think what we'll do is we'll get a private company to a private separate company to build up Novara into a big clunky organisation. Then we'll rent it back off them for sort of like above the odds.
Or you could just
fee.
expand through M&A. Just buy up the rest of the media landscape.
Yeah, I like that. That's good. Anyway, it's time for you to start asking questions.
It's pretty cheap.
As your questions roll in, I'm also going to say it's been brilliant to have about 500 of you watching live tonight, but we want to get those numbers
good.
That is
up.
good.
So please share this video, tweet it out, put it on your Facebook, send it out in an email, put it on WhatsApp, everywhere. Tell people about Novara Media and make them watch this show. Also click like, because it means that more people see the video. It's not just me wanting your...
Put it on Telegram as well.
What's the word?
What's Telegram?
It's the Russian-owned WhatsApp.
What's the word when you want people to say that you want... if you want someone to like your stuff?
Please like me, please. Desperate.
I don't know. I don't know what you're trying to...
We'll think about the word.
Okay.
Put it in the comments. Okay, questions.
Sounds like how many syllables?
Yeah, exactly. They're coming in so thick and fast. Okay, this is good. From Dickie Hands. Great name. John, how would John redress the huge inequality of wealth in this country? Affirmation was the word I was looking for.
Affirmation. Yeah, okay. That's a nice word.
Yeah.
Polysyllabic. I'd get the economy growing again, because that, I mean, we have got two fundamental problems which we've not talked really about. Our lost decade's been a lost decade of lost economic growth and a lost decade of no strategy on productivity. We have to have a much more productive economy. There's no doubt about that. Some of that is the right capital investment, and some of that is new ways of working. Some of that is innovation. So if we can grow the wealth, then we can redistribute it. I actually think that sadly some of the institutions Labour brought in, the tax credit system is being butchered at the moment. That was a major form of redistribution. I think it's good that the support for pensioners has stayed as strong as it has. That was a redistribution to the older people. I think we need to restore support to children and families. But I would target the help that we have to those most in need, and I certainly would go nowhere near two things: the 4-day week or the universal basic income. Both.
I want to there's a related question, which is what does John suggest? What alternative does John suggest to austerity? But I mean that can relate to your last one, which is you want to reinstate the kind of benefits that the Tories cut. Obviously, there was a big movement in the Labour Party from, well, especially when Ed Miliband lost, to say what Labour needs to do is become more fiscally conservative. Have you changed your mind on that? Are you now an anti-austerity political commentator?
Find anywhere where I was in favour of austerity. Genuinely find it anywhere.
Oh no, it's a genuine question. Okay, maybe you weren't. Were you not in favour of austerity?
No,
all evening you've been saying Grace just wants to borrow more money. Isn't being anti-austerity being about borrowing a bit more money?
That's such a ridiculous, simplistic view. I can't believe even you said that. You must be a bit embarrassed to have even said that.
Okay, why is it silly? Go on, tell me.
Because there's not two views of the world. One is George Osborne, austerity, and one is spend, spend, spend.
A third way.
There's always a third way. But like right back to the days of neither Washington nor Moscow, but international socialism. There's always a third way, comrade.
Okay, very good. This is for you, Grace.
Okay.
Anonymous Waz asks, can Grace give any
names?
Can Grace give any comforting support to John about any of his previous policies? What do you think John did well?
I mean, what you've said so far about welfare, I do agree with. I do think that that's a bit of a lacuna at the moment in terms of the manifesto. I'm not sure if it's because, ultimately we are looking to create, and Ed Miliband loved this idea of like pre-distribution, that we'd like, structure into the work.
Sorry.
A terrible phrase. We'd like structure into the working of the economy, make the economy more equal in terms of its like hard wiring, which is basically what, the transformation in political economy that underlies Labour, Corbyn McDonaldism, as you've called it.
Corbynite McDonaldism.
Is about. But I do think that, there's going to be a period during which, obviously there's going to be from whenever a Labour government is elected until we, succeed in bringing in a completely new mode of accumulation, we will need really good welfare policies. And I think, for me, I obviously agree. I think the tax credit system was good. I think universal credit is despicable, not only in the way it's been implemented, but also
it's wrong in principle as well as in practice.
Exactly,
in my view.
Yeah. But I think for me, when you're talking about welfare, you also need to look at structures, so wages, debt in particular. I agree with you on that. What else have you said that's been good?
Oh, what did I do that was good?
You were talking about the unions. You think we should strengthen the unions, which I obviously agree with.
We've got a controversial one. Eduardo Piraz. Where did New Labour find the money to go to war in Iraq and Afghanistan, John? 2 question marks.
Wars are financed by the reserves. That's what the reserves are for. And also, we spend money year after year building up munitions, and then when you use them, they've been bought and paid for bloody years.
I didn't know that that's what the reserves are used for. That's why the reserves have been in secular decline. That's interesting.
I didn't know that either.
Yeah.
Out of interest, you still defend the Iraq War?
Yeah, I was defending it this afternoon.
Really?
Yeah, because any war against a fascist dictator is a good war. I supported the war against the Falklands War against Gautieri. I supported the Second World War. I'd have supported the war against Franco in the 1930s, as people on the left did, and support a war against Saddam Hussein, the fascist dictator. And as my Kurdish friends say, we never ask why did you invade. We ask why did you take so long.
Wow, that puts you in the minority, obviously, of British political commentators to still defend the Iraq War.
Yeah,
partly because it's become very clear that it was fought on false pretenses. There were lies in the dossier. He didn't have WMDs that could be launched in 45 minutes, and that more than 500,000 people have died as a result of that war. And peace has not been brought to the Middle East.
Yet, so.
And also,
this is a big topic. I don't think we're going to get to the bottom of this. I just want a clarification.
It's absolutely a big topic, and let's be absolutely clear about this, which is the terrorists who kill Iraqis day in, day out. Those terrorists are responsible for the deaths that they cause. The car bombs should be interdicted. There should be. The killings are by terrorists. The killings there was a war. The war is over. Kurdistan is liberated. It's not independent, but it's liberated. You cannot lay at Tony Blair's feet terrorist deaths. Those terrorists are responsible for the killings that they do in Iraq, and they should be condemned for it. And they're trying to cleanse the Jews and the Christians, the Assyrians out of Baghdad. Those crimes are those people's crimes, but that's
many views on this. I mean, I think the most important point, we can argue for days on end about whether or not, in the kind of ideal case, philosophically speaking, humanitarian intervention is ever justified, and have a very interesting philosophical debate about that. But we need to contextualize this and look about what the Iraq War was actually about, right? It was essentially, it was used ultimately for profiteering by private companies. It was used to enrich some of the most evil, basically private armies and, resource extracting companies in the world. And we went into that in order to support that particular, basically form of American imperialism, right? And if this was really about humanitarian intervention, you would have seen interventions in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Central African Republic, South Sudan, various countries all around the world who have equally, if not more, horrific dictators. And what you've ultimately ended up with is, because of the profiteering, because of, the underlying logic of American imperialism, a vacuum into which terrorism has entered, and which, ultimately has led to all the problems that we're experiencing today. You can't just make some sort of abstract philosophical case.
None of this abstract. I remember the shame of living in a country which had a Tory government who sat and watched the ethnic cleansing, the breakup of the Yugoslavian Republic, and the ethnic cleansing of parts of former Yugoslavia.
Why is the shame of multilateralism everywhere else, but not when it comes to...
The shame for Iran. Because multilateralism, the Afghanistan's multilateralism is a multilateral intervention. The Iraq War is a multilateral intervention. Kosovo was the one that was unilateral, but... I think that's a good thing, because otherwise there would be ethnic cleansing. And Brexit is the consequence of the decision of Ed Miliband to abandon any principles of intervention. If he had backed David Cameron over intervention in Syria, we would not have had the displacement of so many Syrians. There wouldn't have been so many refugees. The refugee crisis actually is the catalyst for the Brexit.
I think the
just bring
idea that
in-
Western countries can intervene to stop deeply sectarian wars is like just such a symptom of our hubris.
How about
It's
stopping?
like
I wanna bring in-
How about stopping chemical warfare? I think that's a thing we should probably stop.
Okay, so some questions.
Internationally illegal.
Some questions which
Yeah.
follow from that point. So many
Sorry.
people are asking, given that you think we should go to war with any fascist dictatorship, should the UK be invading Saudi Arabia right now? That's one question. And going back to, and from Libertarian Socialist Future, by your logic, should we go to war with Erdogan to help the Kurds? What are the limits of your argument, or what are the consequences of your argument? Two concrete things. Should we invade Saudi Arabia? Should we
Of course, we
invade
shouldn't invade Saudi
Turkey?
Arabia. And of course, we shouldn't invade Turkey.
Why not?
Because we'd lose.
One is they're not fascist dictatorships, and two, they're both allies, and three, Turkey's an
It would be
an
very
ally in
profitable for
NATO.
BAE Systems, to be fair. That would create jobs.
In what
Well,
way
probably
was
wouldn't
Saddam
be.
Hussein a fascist dictator, but Prince Salman is not?
So the Ba'athist Party were not in any form fascist dictators. Of course they were. The way he imposed on his country, the way he had genocide against the Kurds. Let's be really clear about what happened in Halabja.
But that wasn't what the
And
war was
the
about.
gassing of the Marsh Arabs. No, look, I'm a liberal interventionist. The war was actually in defence of the United Nations, and we know that it's in defence of a United Nations resolution, in defence of the United Nations weapons inspectors. This is going to turn into, as all these conversations do, which is like, I'm not changing my mind, right? You guys are not changing your minds. It's the most pointless conversation ever, the Iraq War conversation. What really interests me is, what is it about you guys that wants to try to make me change my mind? I'm never going to change my
All
mind.
right,
on
yeah,
this one.
Well, really, like, it actually really
I think it's
makes
just
me-
mind-blowing. It's
really-
mind-blowing.
No,
but-
it
No,
makes
it's
me
really
really, really
interesting.
angry, actually, because you see it a lot around the kind of
Yeah.
alleged internationalism of liberals today, and they
Okay.
just think that like countries in which we have a strategic interest, that's legit. We should go to the ends of the earth to
No.
defend those places in which we have a strategic interest. And yet you
I've not-
never
no.
hear.
I've
When
just
was the
said- I've
last
just said-
time
I just said we
you
shouldn't
heard,
invade two
like a
countries.
British Prime Minister talking about like, you know, Central Africa, the like nexus of conflict that has been going on there since the 1950s, where like millions of people have died. What happened in the DRC was the bloodiest war in since the end of the Second World War, and no one cares. No one gives a shit, and it freaking
No,
pisses
I
me
love
off.
it. No,
Sorry,
no,
I'm getting overexcited.
I love the fact that you guys are trying to entice me into backing the wars you choose.
We don't want any wars.
No,
We're-
no,
what
no,
we're
you
saying
just-
is
no,
there's a
you
logical
just said-
conclusion.
no,
There's
no,
a
you
logical
said-
conclusion to
you
your
want to-
argument.
no,
Stop
you want to
selling
invade-
weapons to
you
people.
want to
Stop
invade- you
allowing
want to-
like
you want to-
evil dictators
No,
to
you want
siphon their
Congo
money
to be
through the,
invaded,
like, the
Saudi
Cayman
to be
Islands.
invaded, Turkey to be invaded.
Oh, it's look.
Give me
There
a,
are other ways. There are other ways
yeah, the
to
mul-
stop and de-escalate conflict. Firstly, I mean, for like
Look,
one thing, just stop selling them weapons. Stop allowing Bashar al-Assad to park all his assets
Well-
in London property.
well,
Like, it's not
British. I mean,
rocket science.
the Tories sold arms to Iraq. We didn't.
We allow BAE Systems to sell arms basically to whoever the heck it wants, as long as they're not on some sort of list of prescribed regimes. And even then, there are ways of getting around
It's a
it.
reasonably carefully controlled thing. France, that's the country you need to go to if you want to get weapons.
Yeah, France is a whole
will
nother
sell you
bloody-
anything.
yeah.
We don't live in France. Can we
People-
agree on that?
It's all just it is Western imperialism. And I know I sound ridiculous when I say that. It sounds like I throw back to 1970s, but like you have to realise the extent to which people are
Everything you say is a throwback
profiteering.
to the 1970s.
from
Don't worry
wars.
about the imperialism.
All right, people in the comments have stopped asking questions because they're all just their mind has been blown that you're defending the Iraq.
Well, you shouldn't
war.
have asked me the question that you knew the answer to.
Sorry, yeah, no, I shouldn't have done it. It's just in when you see it live, it's something else, I suppose. Anyway, there's a couple of questions that let's do climate change quickly,
Oh yeah, if only, right?
Video.
Let's. We can,
really super quickly.
Yep.
Do we need a big state to solve climate change? Are you worried about that?
We don't need a big state for anything. That's the absolute first rule. The first rule of politics is we do not need a big state. And the second rule, if you think you need a big state, please refer to rule number 1. However, on climate change, we do need urgent action because the climate change crisis is, I think there's two things. There are two crises working themselves out in modern politics at the moment. One of them is economic, and one is the fallout of the global financial crisis. I think there's an economic driver within European politics, American politics, Western politics more broadly. I also think that climate change is an emotional driver. I think that by and large, everybody knows the weather we're currently having in Britain, the weather they're currently having in Australia, the weather they're currently having in America isn't right. It's not natural. It's gone beyond the point where you can kind of go, it's nice, a bit funny. I think people are terrified by two things. One is the notion the planet will see them out, the planet will see me out, the planet will see my kids out, it might not see my grandchildren out if I have grandchildren. That terrifies people. And the second thing is the absolute powerlessness people feel about the way that political discourses and institutions are structured locally, nationally, internationally, multilaterally, and the lack of leadership on that, the lack of urgency on that, and the lack of decisive and urgent action. I think that is the backdrop to almost all of our politics. It's driving us all mad because it's going to kill us.
Okay, that was quite comprehensive. So you get a comprehensive final point, but one of the things it has to answer is, can centrism solve climate change?
Climate change is hardwired into the logic of capitalism. Like, absolutely. Yes, we've seen, this alleged decoupling between emissions and growth in certain countries and certain places. But now where you're getting the real centres of global accumulation are the places in which, you're seeing the highest levels of emissions. You're also seeing the fact that, what was that stat? 100 companies are responsible for a ridiculously high percentage.
Historically, isn't it?
Yeah, of global greenhouse gas emissions, which obviously leaves people feeling powerless because you can't vote to change the way companies work, and apparently you can't vote in until the emergence of Jeremy Corbyn, you couldn't vote in governments that would commit to regulating these companies properly either. And I think we need to bring the politics back into climate change, because we need to remember that ultimately in 100 years, if the world is like a little shattered dust ball, there will be the very most privileged and wealthiest people in society will have moved to the space station or figured out a way of like them and their families surviving on Earth. Like, there is absolutely no question about that. The people that climate change hurts the most is now and is for the rest of time always going to be the poorest. This is a class issue. It is not simply about we're all in this together, we're all going to die. We're not in this together. The rich are always going to be able to protect themselves, and they're going to throw everyone else under the bus.
All right,
that was gloriously
gloriously
dystopian. I love it.
Not if we can take back control.
Okay, if you want a future, I'm going to do a link now. If you want a future that isn't gloriously dystopian, that's although actually it will be a bit like what Grace described, because it's good politics, right?
You're supposed to be unbiased.
I'm not unbiased. You know my politics.
I've still got to work them out. I'm not sure you're clear enough on your politics.
Well, I'm asking the questions.
Yeah,
I'm asking the questions, John. That's why I say invite me on your show, and it'll all become apparent.
That's why you seem so balanced and fair.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, thank you for joining us, John.
A pleasure.
It's always a pleasure to have people we disagree with in the studio. Even though, if I'm honest, it is difficult to thank someone for coming in when they defend the catastrophe, the human catastrophe that was the Iraq War. But anyway, thank you for coming in, even though we disagree with your politics. It was a very lively conversation, Grace, as ever. Thanks for having you in the studio. We'll have you back all the bloody time, won't we?
Thanks, babe.
You're a regular now.
Stop it.
And thanks for watching. Tell your mates to watch this show. If you've got any centrist mates, tell them to watch the show, because from the comments I can see our audience is quite biased. It depends. We don't know what the nationwide support is for centrism at the moment, so we've got no idea what a biased audience would look like. But anyway, send it to your centrist mates. I want to see them in the comments after the show. We will be back next week, same time, same place, 8 p.m. on Monday. This was Tisky Sour. We are Novara Media. Good night.
It's a wrap.
Yeah.
Woo!
Man, the Iraq War stuff's fucking mad.